Welcome to EB5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shah, and other attorneys at Mona Shah & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB5 Investment Voice. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of EB5 Investment Voice. Today, we're going to be talking about the UK investment visa and some of the differences between the United Kingdom's program versus the EB5 program here in the United States. Before we get into it, I'd like to introduce you to your host, Mona Shah.
Hi, Mark. Hello, everybody. So this is an interesting program, Mark. We always wanted to make sure that the EB5 has an international flavor, and of course it does have an international flavor. And we're very honored today to have a guest from the United Kingdom. His name is Amir Zaidi. Hi, Amir, are you there?
Hi, Mona. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hey, Amir. I'm doing well. Glad to have you on.
Fantastic. Yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about the two programs that sit in the same space as the EB5 program, but essentially are the UK's entry into this sort of crowded market of international investors.
Well, before we go any further, Mark, I think it would be nice if Amir would introduce himself and what he does, his firm, and a bit about his background.
Exactly. Mona, you're a pro at this already. Yeah, Amir, if you could introduce us to yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. So I've been practicing immigration law in the United Kingdom for in the region of 16 years now. I hold a separate master's degree in immigration law after the usual law degrees that people take. I initially started my career, the first 10 years of my career essentially were as a barrister, not to be confused with making coffee. It essentially involved what you in the US would call a trial attorney type job description. So I would essentially be required to go to courts, and most of the hearings and tribunals I went to in the United Kingdom were specifically related to immigration. So if you're visualizing anything at the moment, you should visualize myself wearing the old style powdered wig, very Downton Abbey, and a very long black gown. Now, the interesting thing about the UK and the way it splits its legal services is that barristers cannot set up their own firms. And as Mona will no doubt testify to, the UK is similar to the US in the sense that often immigration law is a big challenge for the client. They can't get the right advice, and a lot of the advice they get is exploitative.
Yes, just as a little digression, Mark, here in the United Kingdom, we have two types of lawyers. We have a solicitor, which I actually am, and we have barristers, which Amir correctly states is somebody who's more specialized in trial work, in court work, and they do not have direct access to clients. So as a barrister, Amir, how did you make the transition to having your own law firm?
Well, the thing that drove me forward was largely frustration. I mean, you hear about founders' stories of all sizes of companies, and usually there's some pain point they're trying to fix. The pain point I was essentially trying to fix was as a trial lawyer, and Mona, as you rightly say, with no access to the client. I was meeting clients who had hearing dates coming up, and I realized that the work that was unfortunately poorly done by the UK solicitor essentially meant that I was fighting an uphill battle. And I felt that if clients needed better representation, both at the end point and at the beginning point, well, then why wasn't it me that does it? Why don't I step into that gap? With heavy heart, I thought, let me try moving to having my own firm and having the usual things that lawyers need in a big city, office space, etc. And it turned out actually that there was a pressing need. And I suppose, Mona, one of the things that you will have discovered is that when you are dealing with immigration clients, they're really looking at some reason, they're desperately looking for some reason to trust you.
That's so important, yes.
Yeah, it's about credibility. And I suppose I had one shorthand way of describing why I was a credible lawyer is because I've been doing the difficult part of correcting mistakes, going to court, fighting in front of judges for 10 years. And that usually meant that clients felt that they could trust me. That naturally then led to undertaking work for all types of clients. Listeners will realize that just like New York or just like any big city, London has sectors which are slightly poorer and those who have significant amounts of money. Just by a quirk of choosing to be in a very, very prestigious area of London, if you don't mind me saying, we naturally started picking up lots of international dignitaries and clients of a certain value who were looking at immigration issues for themselves and for their families. Mona no doubt knows that when you're dealing with international clients who are looking to relocate to a Western country, you're often dealing with the cream of those societies. Isn't that right, Mona?
That's right. And many a time they are looking to see whether or not they want to go into the United Kingdom or the United States. 95% at least, or maybe 90%, perhaps that's a bit high, of most investors are considering education. And the best education is in these two countries.
I think that's right. I mean, we don't want to stereotype, but I think Mona's exactly right. If I take the classic case of a wealthy migrant who's looking to relocate to the US or the UK, often they'll have made their own money in very difficult circumstances, often in countries where you need to be on your toes in a very real sense, both to protect your assets, but also sometimes even to protect your life.
Yes.
They don't want the same thing for their children. They want to present the security option to their children, whilst at the same time ensuring that they're not losing the hard-earned funds that they've earned in difficult circumstances.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of motivation, or at least similar motivation, for people that engage the UK investment immigration program as those that exercise the EB5 program here in the United States. But Amir, if you could you tell us what are some of the few key elements of the UK program?
Sure. So there are two programs, and I'll discuss them in turn, but I'll discuss the investor visa first. That's a larger scale investment. So the investment required there is £2 million, which is broadly $2.8 million. So a significant multiplier on the $500,000 of the EB5 program that Mona deals with.
But not as much I can jump in as countries like Australia. I believe Australia is 4 million.
Australia is 4 million, and there are other options in and around Cyprus which are even more expensive. So why does the UK feel it can justify £2 million? Well, the £2 million level has been set and has been in effect since November 2014. So it's a relatively recent change, and it's been doubled. The UK will state that the main reason why it feels it can require an investment level of £2 million for $2.8 million is that it allows you to invest in pretty much whatever you wish. As long as it's based in the UK, you can invest in a combination of UK equity, in corporate debt, in your own private company, or in government bonds, which are the equivalent of treasury bonds in the US.
And Amir, I jump here in. The big thing about EB5 is the fact that EB5 is a job-creating program. The UK and 2 million investor program is not, correct?
Absolutely right. There is some discussion in the UK about what value these £2 million investors actually bring to the UK. And the obvious comparison is with other programs in the US and in the UK which actually require job creation. This program doesn't require job creation. It essentially requires you to open a UK bank account, to place the funds in that bank account, move it then into an investment account, and spend the time doing what you wish. And you can do nothing. You can set up a business, or you can even work for another entity at the same time. And from my perspective, it's very much passive investment. It's the option you choose when you really want to be doing something else.
Amir, the big issue in the United States program, in the EB5 program, is that your money is at risk and there can be no guarantees whatsoever. Is that the case for the United Kingdom program?
Well, the selling point of the investor visa program is that these $2.8 million are not at risk, or should I say, are as at risk as if they were in treasury bonds, for example. So if you bought government bonds, the UK is the person who's guaranteeing those bonds. I don't think there's going to be a circumstance in history, although I'm not a financial advisor, where the UK will default on its government bonds. And so therefore, in a very real sense, these funds are not at risk in the same way they are in the EB5 program.
Right. So Mark, you can hear yourself. There's a huge difference.
It sounds like you just make an investment just as any UK citizen could make the same investment into various, securities, equities, whatever. It sounds like in this case, a foreign national, or at least a citizen not of the United Kingdom, could make an investment of £2 million, just like a UK citizen, but also get the added benefit of immigration status within the UK. So although it doesn't really directly create jobs as like the EB5 program does and tracks, I can see how, having this investment option would make those securities offered in the UK at least raise that market value up. And I can also see why, well, quite honestly, it is £2 million or 2.8 US dollar equivalent, whatever the current rate is, because as you mentioned, it doesn't have to be at risk. You're basically investing in the same thing that UK citizens do.
Right, Mark. I think that's exactly the point, actually. The products that are being invested in are being offered by UK banks, and they are largely products which are available to local individuals, to British nationals or European nationals who don't need visa services. The other thing to note, Mark, which I think is interesting, allied to your point, is of course you don't have to invest prior to you obtaining the visa. You can obtain the visa, touch down in the UK, visit the local financial service providers, the Barclays of these worlds and others, and then make a decision on who you wish to invest in, not only based on the nature of the investment itself, but frankly how much they're charging in transaction fees, etc.
And again, that's a big change from the one in the United States, where you need to make the investment. You really need to make some investment, if not all the investment, prior to filing your petition.
Mona, I think you raise an interesting point where actually I like the EB5's program on this point a little bit more than I like the UK program. And I'll tell you why. Sometimes having too many choices is difficult, and sometimes making decisions about investments on a tight deadline is not a satisfactory way of approaching it. So it sometimes makes a lot of sense when I see clients to actually ask them to, if not invest prior to getting the visa, but at least know what they will be investing in. And one good thing about the EB5 program is that nobody's scrambling around looking for what to invest in.
Well, I beg.
Well, before they get the visa, before they get the status.
Right. There are about 700 plus projects on the market right now. There is a lot out there to choose from. In fact, that's one of the biggest problems with investors. They don't know where to invest in. Whoever can shout the loudest really gets the investor.
Sure. Let me unpack what I said just so that makes a lot of sense. So, yes, in the UK, you don't have to invest before you get the visa. But once you get the visa, you need to invest within 90 days. So you essentially have a 3-month window whilst you're relocating your family and closing your business wherever it might be around the world to then make this investment decision. Now, bearing in mind also, some banks are very concerned about source of funds when those clients are internationally based. 3 months may not be enough, and we certainly have had clients who are extremely worried because they have obtained a visa. That part seemed relatively simple to them, and now they haven't quite prepared where to invest in. And I suppose the good point about the EB5 program, apart from the fact that you need to have a trusted person who you invest with, at least you're looking at both decisions at the same time. At least you've chosen your investment. Then you move forward to inform the government that you're making this EB5 application. And then you don't have this huge panic after you've obtained your visa, just at the time when you want to be focusing on, frankly, education for your children and finding a nice home.
Right. I know, I agree with that. But there is another major difference which we're hoping the government here in the United States will solve this year, and that's the time. It's taking right now 15 plus months for your petition to be adjudicated in the United States. That's a crazy amount of time. It's crazy when you're trying to work out the logistics of moving a family over. What is the time frame in the United Kingdom, Amir?
I'm almost embarrassed about how quick it is because it may indicate that they're not really looking at these applications very carefully. It's extremely quick. Let me give you some examples. It largely depends on where you are applying from. So, for example, the UK has hub centres all around the world. So in the Middle East, Abu Dhabi is a hub center. So if you're applying from somewhere like Dubai or any GCC country, and by that I mean Kuwait and Saudi and Bahrain, for example, the processing time is 5 days.
5 days?
Wow! Let me repeat that. That's not a glitch. It's 5 days. So let me very quickly unpack that. So there is a certain amount of preparation that us as a lawyer have to do. We then have to fill out an online form explaining your personal circumstances. Then we have to provide a dossier of documents. When a client drops off their dossier of documents, they're also fingerprinted and photographed. The point from which they are fingerprinted and photographed, the visa is granted within 5 days. In fact, guys, one thing that may well blow your mind is that certain applicants, if they're based in the United Kingdom already, for example, on a student visa, we are able to process their visas within 24 hours.
Wow. Is that to any country, Amir?
That's for any country. And in fact, the service is so customer focused that they allow the individual to be visited by the Home Office processing officers, either in our offices, in their private office, in the client's home, or even the client's hotel. They will visit you. They will take your fingerprints, they will take your photographs, and within 24 hours they will issue this visa.
That's absolutely amazing. And by the way, for our listeners, the Home Office, the UK Home Office, is the equivalent of the United States USCIS service.
Exactly right. Let me talk to you now about which countries are actually selecting themselves for this visa. Chinese nationals and Russian nationals are the two biggest categories of individuals who are choosing this visa, unsurprisingly. What also affects those numbers is that for the UK investor visa, there is no language requirement. You don't have to prove you're proficient in English. The other countries that often choose to apply for this visa, third is the United States, and often we're seeing those are US businessmen looking to set up in the UK, or those who work in financial services who want to visit the UK, want to make a short career break in the UK in financial services, but don't want to be tied down to a sponsored H1L1 type visa. Instead, they want to be flexible and not have a sponsor, and they will go for the investor visa, invest their own funds into the UK, and then will make the same back by moving from bank to bank or financial institution to financial institution inside the UK on the investor visa. Other notable countries include Hong Kong, Pakistan, India, Egypt, Canada, and Nigeria.
Okay, gosh. Okay, Amir, we're running out of time, but I did want you to mention a little bit about the entrepreneurial visa.
So the entrepreneur visa, Mona, is very similar in some ways to the EB5 with key differences. It requires a much lower amount of investment, £200,000, so that's $280,000 currently. And this is not passive investment. This is an investment into business. So how it would work is that you would show that you had £200,000 and you had a business plan and you were able to speak English. Once those key factors are in place, again, very quick processing time, 5 days and 14 days, etc., then you would come into the UK, and at that point you would have 6 months to register a company, which is a very simple process, and then you would have 3 years to invest and spend the £200,000 in your business and hire 2 people. At the end of that 3-year period, then you would extend your visa, showing that you'd actually invested into a company, and then you would move on to permanent residency. Now, Mark, you mentioned about the investor visa that it looks like a very normally commercially available product or products.
Right.
Mark, it's the same for the entrepreneur visa. You don't have to select a particular sector for the UK entrepreneur visa. What you simply do is arrive and then you set up or start up a new business, or you join an existing business. In the same way that somebody who assesses businesses, private equity guys and corporate finance guys might do, as a serial entrepreneur might do, just start up from scratch. You can do that.
But I do believe the entrepreneur visa does have the English requirement, Amir, right?
It does. And so therefore, when you look at the countries who are typically choosing to generate entrepreneur visa clients, those are the countries where English is widely spoken. So we're talking about, again, the US is second. Pakistan and India make up 1 and 3. There's significant movement from Canada, Australia, but just general movement from anyone who has studied English. So Egypt is a big producer of entrepreneur visa clients because some of the leading universities in Egypt all teach in the English medium. Nigeria is a big country for the entrepreneur visa too. So again, a wide gamut of countries, but whilst China and Russia are certainly present on the top 10 list, they don't make up 1 and 2. Number 1 and 2 is made up by Pakistan, USA, and thirdly is India. And that's probably indicative of the fact that Chinese and Russian nationals, the pool of English speakers is just a little bit smaller.
Right. Well, as you can hear, Mark, and to our listeners, there's a lot of differences between the UK and the US visa. And I do believe, from my experience, that at the end of the day, it boils down to people's preferences as to where they want to live. If somebody wants to go battle through the 15-month process that you do with USCIS and put their money at risk, even though, albeit it's only 500,000, they do because they want to be in the United States. And again, people who want to be in the United Kingdom want to be in the United Kingdom. So I really do not see that there is a great deal of a competition between the two programs per se, unlike the program between the United States and Canada.
Yes.
Right. And I agree with that. But one of the reasons why I like diving into and exploring this topic is, it's really not a marketing conversation of the United States versus the United Kingdom, but it's understanding those investment immigration programs and how they're a little different, especially now we may be in a transitional time with the EB5 program. To know what other countries are doing and how they're doing it may give you some type of indication of what the U.S. may do, or it may not, but also it gives you an idea of, well, perhaps why some countries do what they do and really how they're different. So I think when I learn something about a topic that's somewhat adjacent, maybe not, completely different, but somewhat adjacent, helps me understand, well, the key topic. And for this whole program is about EB5, but I think really diving into the United Kingdom's investment program helps me understand EB5 a little bit better.
Mark, I think that's exactly right. Mona's exactly right when she says clients don't really regard it as a choice, because clients are driven by the dream of themselves and the dreams of their families. And so somebody will have, frankly, the dream of setting up on the West Coast or the East Coast, or particularly wants to move to Boston, for example. And others will hark back to times they spent in London, or they're Cambridge graduates, and so they want to be in and around Cambridge. Others have relatives in Scotland, in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and they'll want that. But Mark, your point is valid too, actually, because the governments don't realize this, I don't think. I think the governments actually believe they are in competition with each other. And so when UK immigration is very fast moving, when you hear government advisory committees advising our lawmakers, they always refer back to other programs, including the EB5. And almost like a shopkeeper wants to make sure that he has all different prices of shoes available on his shelf to capture all customers, they're almost figuring out where to position themselves. And so therefore this discussion, I think, is probably very useful to sort of get people to understand, and lawmakers perhaps even to understand, if anyone's listening, about how the different programs are so different that in some ways, like Mona says, there is no competition. People are driven by their intentions, and they'll either pay the money and go ahead for a UK program, or they'll take the extra time that the US takes, because they don't want to end up in a country which they don't want to live in, frankly.
So, Amir, at the top of the program, you mentioned that there are 2 investment programs in the UK for immigration, and one is for £2 million. What's the other one? I think we touched upon it, but I really want to make it clear to our listener that we're talking about 2 different programs. Yeah,
sure, Mark. So choice number 1, or option number 1, is the £2 million visa, which is the investor visa, which we talked about right at the top of the program. The second option is the entrepreneur visa, which requires an investment of £200,000. When I was talking about job creation and the investment into business and spending of £200,000, that was the visa I was referring to. For the listeners really to unpack this and put them in 2 separate compartments, they should think of them as follows. The £2 million investor visa is for individuals to invest passively and probably end up doing something else. The entrepreneur visa is for them to actively invest into a company which they direct and manage and run. And it also requires you to have good standards of English, because of course you'll be engaging with an English speaking client base when you run that business.
And when you say good standards of English, Amir, there is an English language test, correct?
Yes.
So we have $2 million for an individual's passive investment, or $200,000 for an active investment into the company that person is going to be working in, going to be an active participant. So those are the two UK programs, right?
That's exactly right, Mark. One very active and one very passive.
And it almost sounds like the second program is much like our E2 visa here. Mona, is that, I know that there's some differences, but.
Yes, it is very similar to the E2, but I would probably say more like the EB5 because E2 does not have a job creation element and EB5 does. And E2 does not transition into the green card, whereas Tier 2 eventually
exactly
give you permanent residence.
You caught ahead of me because I was going to say that about the E2 visa where it's essentially a non-resident visa, but this one is. Okay. Well, thank you for that.
There is one area where I think the EB5 has a lot to teach the UK programs, and that's in the field of source of funds. The UK, probably due to budgetary issues, does not adequately check the source of funds internationally. So these £2 million, these £200,000, there is no proper source of funds check. In fact, it's a very light touch, almost embarrassingly so. What the UK simply requires is that those funds are held in a bank account anywhere in the world for 90 days. If they've been held in a bank account for 90 days, essentially they are deemed to be from a clean source, for want of a better phrase.
Right, very different from the US, where we have to document the path and the source of funds in intricate detail.
And in fact, Mona, again, rather embarrassingly, if you cannot wait 90 days, if you simply explain in a very basic way where the source of funds were from, so for example, well, I got these in a divorce, or this is from a sale of a business or a sale of a house, or in fact you say, well, my father has gifted me this money or a friend has gifted me this money, then in fact very little checking is done on how the individual who gifted you the money obtained it. And I think that's something that is ripe for reform, but at the moment it's a very light touch and probably goes a long way to explaining why these visas can be processed in 5 days. If you're not checking anything, you're not going to take a lot of time processing.
Thank you for that, Amir. And for our listeners, we're going to be diving into source of funds for the EB5 program in a later episode. Amir Zaidi, thank you so much for coming on and explaining to us the UK immigration investment program and really kind of comparing and contrasting the differences between that and the EB5 program. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Amir. And I'm sure we're going to have some queries and have you back on the show in the future.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us today on EB5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shah and Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Or call the office at 212-233-7473. Don't worry about trying to write all this down, as it's already embedded in your podcast player of choice. The contact information and other valuable resources can be found there. I'd like to thank Amir Zaidi for coming on today and discussing with us the key differences between the United Kingdom's investment visa program and our own domestic EB5 program here in the United States. This concludes our 10th episode, and I want to let you know that this podcast isn't going away, but we're shifting from a twice-a-week format to a once-a-week format, and that we have more great topics lined up for you. Make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB5 Investment Voice.